primarily the command and control, especially in the warfighting domain, is a human endeavor. And so how do you do those liaisons? How do you communicate with allies and partners? Back to my number one priority in the international partner strategy. You can have a conversation all day long about this, but at some point you've got to snap the chalk line and start doing things and building these operations centers out and building.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. This week on Wednesday, two big budget events occurred. First, the House Appropriations Committee advanced the House version of the fiscal 2027 Defense Appropriations Act. In this House version of the spending bill, the top line for the Department of Defense is a smidgen over $1 trillion. In the House bill, the Space Force would receive $55.5 billion. That's more than $3.5 billion short of what the administration asked for. But there's more. The administration was also seeking $12 billion more for the Space Force through a budget reconciliation bill. So altogether, the Trump administration is seeking roughly $71 billion. But observers say that reconciliation bill has stalled. So for the second event, also on Wednesday, the administration sent Congress another defense budget request, ostensibly for a supplemental bill. Inside of that is $4 billion for Space Force. As this is an evolving story, it doesn't really tie up neatly with the conclusion, so stay tuned. And here's the part that travels beyond Washington. As the United States spends big on defense, it's been telling its allies they have to spend more too. And in 2 weeks, NATO leaders meet in Ankara, Turkey, where a 5% of GDP target will be front and center. Some, like Germany, have answered that call with big budgets for the development of military space systems. And that affects force design, especially for multinational operations in the space domain. Which brings me to my guest. Air Marshal Paul Godfrey sits at the exact point where that question gets answered. He's a Royal Air Force officer and the first commander of UK Space Command. Before that, he was the director of the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And for the past 2 years, he's been on the Space Force command staff, serving as the Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships. A year ago, he just helped put out the Space Force's first international partnership strategy. This week, I wanted to know what a year of actually building it looks like. What's moved and what hasn't? Here's our conversation. Hey, Godders. Thank you so much for making the time to come back on the Downlink podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here. And different room this time, but still in the Pentagon.
What room are we in, actually?
So we are in the small conference room. So to describe it to listeners, there's a reasonably large table, even though it's a small conference room. What do we got? About 10 chairs around the table, a couple of TV screens on the wall, a bunch of clocks, and we're next to CSO's office. So actually, I spend a lot of time in this room when we're having get-togethers with CSO and talking about stuff.
So
I'm not a stranger to
place to get questioned then.
Well, it depends what the questioning is, whether it's from CSO or whether it's from you.
Well, let's see. Let's see how you do then, right? Gutters, you are an air marshal and a decorated fighter pilot who became the first commander of UK Space Command. You have been here in the Pentagon serving as a U.S. Space Force Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships for 2 years now. Before we proceed, I think it would be super helpful if you could explain your portfolio, especially the future concepts part. I know you've done this before. I know you're rolling your eyes again now, but just bear with me because I don't want people thinking that you work on the implications of mass drivers on the moon or warp drive technologies, right? Because the diction can confuse, especially those in the audience who are not insiders. So could you take a quick moment and just clarify your remit.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't rolling my eyes because it is something that people bring up the whole time. So
he was rolling his eyes.
I definitely wasn't. It's funny. I heard someone say the other day, the length of your duty title is inversely proportional to your importance in the organization. So, I'll let the listeners work that one out. So when we arrived, it was future concepts and partnerships. And actually, for the last couple of years, I've primarily been concentrating on the partnerships side of things. 3 lines of effort, 3 priorities that I've been working on. Strengthen partnerships, which is ultimately has been about the international partnership strategy, which is out last year, and now we're executing it. In fact, we had a big old steering committee on execution yesterday that maybe we can talk about later. The second one is harnessing CSPO, the Combined Space Operations Initiative. 5 Eyes, France, Germany, Italy, Norway, and Japan. And the progress that we are making there. Over the last couple of years, I'm part of what is termed the executive secretariat for that. And then the final one was engaging NATO. And I know you want to speak about NATO. And that has been a fascinating journey in the last couple of years. I've recently gone back from the NATO Space Commanders Conference where I gave a presentation on a couple of things, and maybe we'll talk about that. Actually, recently, I have been getting more into the future concepts because as the Space Force stands up, the Futures Organization, which will be known as the S9, working really closely with the team there to understand as they look at future concepts, as they look at the future operating environment, as they look at the objective force. In fact, I probably don't need to know this, but I just come from a fitness test and I was chatting with one of the guys who works in the S9. And we talked exactly about this future concepts. And we were talking specifically about battle management and how we're going to go and get together in the next couple of weeks so that I can bring an allied input into the battle management, the command and control discussion for future concepts. So that has been one that I've kind of been waiting as we've settled on what the futures organization is going to look like within the Space Force. But that hasn't stopped me over the last couple of years talking with allies about their own future concepts, where they see themselves going.
So this isn't a technical thing in terms of technology.
No.
Right. That's what I really wanted to clarify to folks, because when you think about future concepts, a lot of people who use those kinds of words are talking about, technology or the Air Force Research Lab or what have you. And I just wanted to really make that super clear that it's actually about the concept of operations, right?
100%. And so if you take that conversation I was just having with one of the guys, this was about, okay, what does command and control look like in the future for the Space Force? As the Space Force is growing, budgets are increasing, we're getting at additional space superiority squadrons, all of these things. How do you command and control something that is global, but is also regional at the same time? And you can look at, without going too far down this particular rabbit hole, all of us have got some sort of baggage from our previous domains, or if you're a long-term space individual, baggage from the space domain. Certainly my baggage is being the director of the Command Air Operations Center at Al Udeid. And so I say baggage, I think it's a good start point to have.
I think
of
experience
how you,
is really the word you really want to use.
What does command and control mean? Are you constantly having to ask someone what to do? Or is it that full mission command? There's a term we use, mission type orders, where, hey, here's your mission. You go away and tell me what you've done, when you've done it, and come back if you need any more orders. Is that what we're going to do in the space domain? How do you mechanize that through communications and operations centers worldwide? What do you need regionally and what do you need globally? Is it a single operations center? Is it multiple operations center? How do they talk to each other? Where are the liaisons? That's the biggest thing for me. Whilst we're now clearly in a period of artificial intelligence and probably stepping into the unknown as to how that is going to help us in the future. How is that going to tighten the OODA loop? Primarily, the command and control, especially in a warfighting domain, is a human endeavor. And so how do you do those liaisons? How do you communicate with allies and partners? Back to my number one priority in the international partner strategy. You can have a conversation all day long about this, but at some point you've got to snap the chalk line and start doing things and building these operations centers out and building the command and control networks and so on. So it is fascinating. That's why I love my job.
I think everything that you've just said is going to find a foothold in probably every single question that I'm hoping to get across. And I love how it's actually going to take this conversation forward and move it into the future. Because, the reason why I wanted to sit down with you is because it has been a year since.
I can't believe that, by the way. It genuinely feels like yesterday we were sat up the hall talking.
Yeah. Well, no, we're actually all a year older. I'm feeling it.
I'm feeling it after that fitness test.
But it has been a year since, you put out the international partnerships strategy, right? And there has been a lot that has gone on within the past year. I mean, we can't deny that out there in the political world, geopolitically, international partners feel comparatively strained. And, let me say that. I know you can't. That's fine. But from inside the Pentagon and in the space domain, you and your team have been implementing the Space Force International Partnership Strategy, and it is a year old this month. There are 19 tasks, 3 of which are yours, right? You and your team own them. And you also have a special responsibility of holding others accountable. That was in the forward for delivering on those tasks. So I'd love it if you could give everyone who is not an insider that baseline on what that international partnership strategy is, just like the elevator pitch.
I'm smiling here, not rolling my eyes, because I'm glad people are reading it. And obviously, you would have done research, and we talked about it last year.
I had to reread it.
Yeah, there you go. Reread it, and I do reread it to see did we get it right. And so stop me if I start going on too long here. But
elevator pitch. What is the strategy?
Elevator pitch. It is about embedding allies and partners in Space Force processes across 3 areas: force design, architecting the force development, so working with allies and partners to build the force, and then force employment. So exercising that sort of stuff to enable us to operate together. That's the elevator pitch. Clearly, it is complex, and you mentioned 19 what we term specified tasks.
Well, that's also because there's a lot of different parts to the Space Force now. So I don't think we should actually be that surprised that, the tasks are in double digits at all.
Well, so
right?
the tasks go to triple digits, because what we did once we released the strategy is that we then sat down, and we call it an estimate. So you sit there, bring everyone into a room for multiple days in this particular time frame, and you look at each block: force design, force development, force employment. And from a specified task, I go and do this. You can imagine there are a number of implied tasks that roll out of them. And then for each of those implied tasks, there's probably a number of things as well. So determining and agreeing all of those was a big thing. And there's over 100 in the end. But the way that we track it, and we just did this yesterday, we did our second steering committee, because implementing a strategy is often where strategies fall apart.
And who's in this steering committee?
It's a member of every single area in the Space Force, more or less. So the way that the headquarters is divided up, we've got from S1, essentially human resource, 2 is intelligence, 3 operations, all the way up to the 10. But then we've got field commands, and we've got our components as well. And there may be people that are interested, intelligence community, that sort of people. So not directly tasked by us, but may have their own international strategy and are interested in, hey, what are you guys up to? So
it is an orchestration, so that everybody's rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, 100%. So
and not hitting somebody else's wake.
That's probably one of the bigger things, right? Because so if you take a commander of one of our components, so Space Forces Europe, Africa, from a Space Force headquarters perspective, they've actually got 103 nations in that area of responsibility. Can you go and speak to 103 nations? No, you can't. So there's a prioritization that goes on there. So what the headquarters has done is prioritized the nations that we think there should be a good dialogue with. And actually, we've also prioritized for each country that we think is a priority, the areas which we think will be important, i.e. where a nation might be able to fill a gap. And it's a two-way conversation where that nation thinks it wants to go as well. Talk about interoperability, all of these sorts of things.
Which nations are you talking about, though? Are you talking about the CISPO nations?
Yeah,
or are you talking about the NATO nations?
No, so notice NATO as another part of the portfolio.
That's what I wanted to clarify.
But when you are, it is always about prioritization. And so right now we're starting with the CISPO nations plus another couple of nations. But so we'll set priorities from a Space Force perspective, but that commander in a component, so representing the Space Force in a combatant command, so in this particular example, EUCOM will have their own security cooperation strategy. And the trick is that we aren't giving them priorities that are in the opposite direction to EUCOM. And also, there's US Spacecom as well as a global combatant command who will have their own security cooperation strategy. And so I've kind of fallen into these jobs over the last few years of sort of sitting in the seams and looking at where the friction appears and trying to reduce the friction. And so we have a really good relationship with the US Spacecom in terms of, okay, what do they want to achieve in the European theater from a Spacecom perspective? So, essentially 100 kilometers and above. What does the headquarters want to do and what does EUCOM want to do? And actually, we're all pretty aligned, but from a execution of the strategy is then mission command. Here are your priorities. Commanding General of Space Forces Europe, Africa, go get on with it. And feedback, if anything is different. Feedback when you've had a conversation with one nation, multiple nations, or so on. And then we also leave it to that component. If we gave them, let's call it 8 country priorities, they've still got whatever the maths is on that particular one, 95 other nations. They've then got to work out how do they do the touch point with those nations? Do they need to do a touch point with those nations? Can they hit it all at a space conference at the Africas or whatever it happens to be? So you can see it is ultimately about prioritization, and then it is about feedback so that we can reset those priorities next year and hopefully now start developing those relationships with those different nations and start bringing in the capability. And you mentioned sort of political changes, but the burden sharing thing is something that we've all been trying to do from a space perspective. Everyone's got tanks, ships, aeroplanes, all of those sorts of things. It is only in the last 6 years, that allied nations have stood up space commands or equivalents and are really at the beginning of their journeys. And so this sort of mentoring, if you like, from the US Space Force to help them build their own capabilities, help them build capabilities that are interoperable with the US Space Force if we needed to warfight together, that is a big thing. And that is ultimately about what burden sharing is. The Space Force cannot look after everyone around the globe, protect and defend their satellites. Nations are going to want to do that and have to do that as well.
So you just covered a whole bunch of things right there, right?
I didn't breathe either.
No, you didn't. It's clear that you passed your fitness test. Absolutely clear. So let me just kind of redirect and get us a little bit more on track here. Not that we were off track, just there were many tracks, right? Your first line of effort is what you call shaping futures.
Yeah. Getting
allies into the room where Space Force designs the force it wants by 2040. When we spoke last year, that was largely your argument to make. Now it's in doctrine. The objective force names allies as a founding design principle, hybrid by design, interoperability by design. Do allies and partners, especially the CISPO folk, are they active participants in that design process now? Are they in the room? I mean, some of them really are very serious spacefaring nations. Others, not so much, but they're there. It's cool. They're getting there. But yeah, I mean, how do they actually contribute to the force design?
So let me give you an example. Let's go to line of effort or priority 2 with that harness CSPO. So one of the things that we're doing in CSPO is the US Space Force will lead, has already, and there'll be further conversations about space domain awareness, SDA, force design. And at the very basic level, that's the Space Force putting out where the Space Force is going, understanding where the other 9 nations in the room, where they're going, and now looking at, okay, so what are the opportunities here? Because a way that I'm framing it this year is using General Saltzman's, the Space Force's theory of competitive endurance. I don't know whether you've seen that, but that is the theory of success, right? And the first tenet of that is avoid operational surprise. Where do allies and partners come into that? Well, it's geography, it's space domain awareness, sensors, whether it's on orbit, whether it's in terrestrial, is the ability to share information so that you are reducing your blind spots, so that we can concentrate on the threat, so that we can attribute when required, because clearly this is a big old domain to go and
it's massive.
Surveil.
People don't get it.
Yeah. So
I don't get it. I mean, it's like that kind of big. It's very hard to imagine how big the actual
impossible.
Geography.
It's impossible to imagine. The whole 36,000 kilometers away, that's twice the distance from sort of here to Sydney. And you are trying to look with a sensor to find out whether that Russian or Chinese or whatever satellite that's coming close to yours has particular intent. You can tell there's intelligence there. Do they have a particular intent? What are the capabilities of that particular satellite? And so on. And it's not just in the space domain, because there's a link and a ground segment here that has physical and cyber threats as well. But if I just go back to that force design, just having that CSPO conversation, where are we going? Are there linkages? Can we do things together? Are there joint programs that we could run for these sorts of things? When we output from a particular sensor, does it output it in a data format that I could ingest in my system? What are our own systems? And so on and so on and so on. So
is this happening? I mean, they're present.
Yep.
That's what I'm really running, because last year it's not that they, international folks weren't here. Hello, you're sitting right here in front of me right now. So it's pretty clear. But being actually part of force design is a different level of involvement, right? And
there are a couple of aspects to this as well, because it's not just the international side. The Space Force is only 6 years old. So it is developing its own force design procedures, processes, institutional processes. So we've worked this out together over the last couple of years. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay, because this is just going right along the same lines here, because one of the 3 tasks that your own office owns is to codify in policy and directives the processes for integrating partners across all functions. Now, a year on, how far along is that process? And I don't mean for this to sound flip at all, because Space Force has grown so much, because it has, many different facets and components and et cetera, I do believe that this is a pretty gargantuan task. So where are we in that task?
Yeah. So again, I know exactly where we are, because I came from that
meeting, right?
I ran the steering committee yesterday.
Okay. So how are we doing?
Surprisingly to me, I didn't expect to be as far as we are right now. There were a lot of so I have a RAG, red, amber, green assessment of all of those 19 tasks. And on our little tracker, you can open that up and see all the subtasks. There's a few ambers around there, unsurprisingly. We've only been at this essentially executing for about 6 months now. But as the space, I'd rather be lucky than good, right? So having been here for a couple of years and people seeing an ally around, when already, even before the international partner strategy, the Space Force has developed a process for, as we just talked about, force design, a process for the objective force, a process for budgeting and those sorts of things. There's where, unsurprisingly, someone may, in a room full of US individuals, may have forgotten, may have not even considered allies and partners. Because guess what? Like I said, 6 years ago, there wasn't a huge amount of space going on with the allies and partners. I mean, there's been a lot in terms of SATCOM, but, touch points, and there haven't been space commands. But more and more people will think of it because, hey, look, isn't there a Brit in the office down the road? Or there's another Brit. We've got an Italian exchange. We're picking up more and more of these exchange officers and soon liaison officers as well. So when these processes through Space Force instructions, whatever it happens to be, get staffed across the Pentagon, we get to see it. And I say we, there's only 4 of us and we're about to lose one of the guys. So 3 of us in the office. More often than not, I don't have a huge amount to say because someone has already put something about allies and partners in there. And so yesterday was a really good conversation. And I think so from a process perspective, we really are getting there. Now, executing those processes, different. I think that is where we'll start to see more issues, primarily because Space Force itself, 10,000 uniformed Guardians, the allies, not huge space cadres, plus we're doing CSPO, plus we're doing Olympic Defender, plus there's NATO conferences.
They're pressing up too, though. I mean, if you look at what Japan's been able to accomplish, what was it in 2020? I think they had maybe 20 people dedicated to defense and space or military space, and now they should have an end strength of 880.
I know.
So that's pretty
in the UK,
stunning.
I always joke, we went from 6. It wasn't really to start with. There were a number of people who did space to 600 in 3.5 years. But you are still limited by the amount of people with the expertise in force design or force employment or force development that can go physically dial in. Time zones are an issue,
I know you said that last year.
Pick the right time zone. Someone's getting, going to bed late or getting up early in the morning in order to do these things. But I'm super heartened by the fact that, we had these great conversations about the processes, and we're starting to build the ally considerations into the processes early.
Speaking about communication, though, this was another thing that you said last year, in addition to having late night phone calls or VTCs, that's video teleconferences for anybody out there who doesn't know that. Your second enduring goal in the strategy was a single word, and that's communicate. And part of that communication was that things were overclassified, that you were in some ways prohibited from communicating with each other. How are we doing there? Are you able to open the lid more to the allies and partners, or are we still stuck in some sort of weird space where, I'm sorry, we just can't talk about that because that's classified?
We are definitely pushing the boundaries. We're not there yet. I would put this as amber. We're definitely not green yet. But if I take recent example, so I've talked about CSPO. CSPO, we're linked with Operation Olympic Defender. So 7 of the 10 nations, it's the Five Eyes plus France and Germany, are within Operation Olympic Defender. When I went to the NATO Space Conference the other day, the day after, there was a Olympic Defender Commanders meeting. And at that Olympic Defender Commanders meeting, they debriefed, and I was able to sit in on this, they debriefed 4 operations that have been undertaken under the banner of Olympic Defender. There's 3 of them that have been bilateral operations, 1 a multinational operation in there. Those operations would not have been able to take place unless there was I'm not going to say declassification, but having on both sides is not just the US, this is other nations as well.
Maybe this is
classifying at the right level in order to be able to share.
And also to marry up, because this is a two-way street, right? They have classified stuff.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying.
So this is really more of a marrying up of your classification and an agreement to actually share this information, and that you won't go, sharing with, whoever else. Right?
It's exactly that. At the end of the day.
Do you actually have to have an agreement to do that, though?
Yeah. So that's one of the things we're looking at in CSPO at the moment is it an agreement? Is it, how much more do we need? The great thing is having Olympic Defender that is doing operations, right? Because if we were sat here without anyone actually doing the operations at the end of the day, we'd be trying to work out these sort of ethereal concepts. But actually, we're getting debriefs directly from them. So we now know, okay, are there issues with sharing a French sovereign telescope data directly to the network with allies and partners? Does everyone have access to the network? Do they have chat, video, email, all of those sorts of things? So, at the technical level, building that network out and allowing sharing at the higher classifications is one thing. And then back to the agreement. And I think what we've come down to is you don't need a big matrix with all the agreements in. It's down to the individual nations. What are Germany willing to share with the other, in Olympic Defender, the other 6 nations? It might be the same for all nations. It might be different for other nations. They might share more with one nation than they do with another, depending on history and agreements and so on. But we're testing this out now. We're trialing it. And one of the things we're doing with CSPO is we're running an exercise this year to actually look at exactly this point. Are we good with what we can share? Are we at the bare minimum for potential war fighting? Or do we need to go further?
Well, from Olympic Defender, what kind of lessons were learned from that? I know that you can't talk about the operations side of it, but you can talk about the things that are in your lane, which is the communications part of it. And because this is a CSPO issue, I also wonder, what has been happening with CSPO, because the Kiwis put out a sort of press release, I guess you could say, about what was discussed in Colorado in April. And it was said that, the domain is complex and less secure, right? Really, no kidding. But they also said that everyone who was in the room was going to review their approach to keep the forum fit for purpose, which then a whole bunch of people took out of context. But that's because the word approach is an opaque policy term, which could mean kind of anything you want. So seeing that you've been talking about CSPO quite a bit, you seem to have, meet with them quite regularly. What actually has to be reviewed to make it stronger?
So one of the things,
and I know that you guys are going to be meeting in December, all the principals again, right? In Oslo. So this is happening right now as we're talking.
Yeah. And actually next week, there's a technical interchange meeting as part of CSPO. There is a team here in the Pentagon, Space Force, and a couple of others that are the interoperability working group leads, also with another nation. Australia is about to pick it up. Norway has been the co-lead for that. And there's a policy and legal working group as well, where again, the US is leading has been France recently. And I think off the top of my head, it's going to Canada. The advantage of CSPO is you've got the policy people in the room as well. Learning lessons from actual operations is pretty straightforward. You go out and do stuff. And honestly, the thing that impressed me the most, you say, what lessons did we learn, was just how advanced the operations are, especially in the orbital domain. When you're looking at SATCOM, other capabilities, and the planning that went into a couple of these, I know this will frustrate people that I can't talk about it, but the planning that went in, and then just how well these things were executed, despite the amber side of, working through classification on networks and within, certainly my experience within the UK is multiple systems in an operations center where they may not be linked because of classification or whatever. So you've got to take output from one, put it into another, but all the nations.
You got to literally walk it across.
Yeah. In some cases.
Yep.
And so all of the nations are learning and are developing capabilities that kind of bring that together so that you can operate at the speed of light rather than the sort of speed of walk.
And anticipate, I would imagine, as well, because if you're actually watching your colleagues doing stuff, that you learn from that to anticipate and ask, and therefore you can start running the traps to get that thing ready to literally walk it across.
Exactly. And so the lessons identified, so this is what we have not had before in CSPO, right? Is that we have not had codified lessons identified given to us from operations And the way General Whiting, as the commander, multinational force Olympic defender, will run it, he'll write a formal memo to CISPO with, hey, look, here are the things I think we need fixing in order to accelerate how we do operations.
And get more out of Olympic defender,
correct.
Quite frankly.
And so so where you mentioned New Zealand talking about the approach,
yes,
we have not had this before. So we need to understand, okay, so we had a Vision 2031, and we built a campaign plan, if you like, around that. What does Vision 2035 look like? What does Vision 2040 look like? What is the approach that these multiple nations going to look like? Are we going to invite other nations in? There are plenty of nations knocking on the door. Because if I had to use an analogy, it is almost that CISPO gets you match fit to be able to conduct coalition space operations, kind of generically. Olympic defender, people have come off the bench and are conducting space operations. Italy, Norway, and Japan in CISPO are not currently in Olympic defender. There's reasons for that over the last couple of years as we have built out, we've gone from scratch. Olympic defender has been around since 2019, but actually as multiple nations have come in, it's about developing battle rhythms, operating procedures, all of these sorts of things. So, and CISPO expanded by 3 nations, Italy, Norway, and Japan, just about 3 years ago as well. So at some point in the near future, I'm sure the doors will be open, but again, we've got to understand the approach. So, does it have to have consensus? What nations are knocking on the door? What capabilities do they bring? Are they ready to sit on the bench in order to then potentially go into space operations? So I see us as the organization that pulls together it's ultimately organize, train, and equip. It's what are the networks that we need? What are the capabilities? What's the training? Does that make sense?
It does, because this isn't exactly NATO. NATO has particular kinds of rules. NATO's been around for a good time. So all of those sort of SOPs have been developed and are accepted across the NATO member countries and also NATO partners. But speaking of NATO, I actually had a couple of questions about NATO.
Yeah, go for it.
But they've shifted because you've been, hanging out with NATO. So instead, why don't you tell us what you have been learning in your interactions with NATO? And plus, we have a NATO summit in just under 2 weeks.
Yeah, 7th of July.
Right. So what is on the horizon for NATO and space operations? I mean, we've got a new...
Stand by for a potentially big answer on this one. Jump in when you want to pull a particular thread. So the bottom line with NATO, I may have mentioned this last time, was I don't think many of the space... I think they would have come to this conclusion at some point in the recent past. But certainly from a UK perspective, same with France, Germany, is that when NATO declared space an operational domain in 2019, that was a wake-up call.
That was big.
And then, a further communique is about the potential of a Article 5 in space. I mean, you could debate that
that came out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the attack on Viasat, which is a U.S. company, and the routers were in Europe. Yep, that was a really interesting moment, wasn't it?
So it's an interesting one, right? So now at the political level in NATO, you've got to understand, and there's a danger of me going down all sorts of rabbit holes here, but recently they had a sort of political tabletop exercise that was about space, and a lot of that is about education of so many people in NATO that just the same as it is in every part of the world, that feeling that people have taken space for granted without understanding that
the vulnerabilities of
correct.
Space.
It is vulnerable and you need to protect it if your joint force is going to be successful in any future conflict. And so right from the top, NATO is starting to get into that side of things. If you look at whether it's JFC, Joint Forces Command Norfolk, or Naples, or whatever, they have regional plans. They're now, if they haven't already, but they're now looking at, with an understanding of what sort of space capabilities the allies bring to the table, what are your space requirements within those regional plans? What space requirements would you need to conduct this particular operation or this operation in the Baltic or whatever it happens to be? So you can see at that top level, there's a huge interest now as they start to develop their space structures.
I would imagine your experience with CISPO would be highly invaluable to this.
So if you look at CISPO, it is, whilst you've got Japan, Australia, and New Zealand in there, all three of those are aligned partners with NATO.
Right.
And so you've got a subset of NATO in the sort of Venn diagram of the 32 nations in there, with the 10 nations that we've got inside of CISPO. Now, that, for example, what we want to do in CISPO is look at, just take standards, which NATO has done ever since its inception of standardization agreements, STANAGs. We could do it for data. We could do it for space refueling. We could do it for a number of different things that NATO has done that has allowed NATO nations. When I was flying airplanes around Europe, I could go and land somewhere. An F-16 crew from the Netherlands could service my Harrier because we were cross-trained using NATO standards, those sorts of things. We're trying to get to those in the space domain. If you've got a small group that can work that out from actual operations and then transmit this to NATO and then they take it on, then actually, that rising tide floats all boats. Then we can lead the development, or I say lead the development, we can influence the development of standardization within NATO. It's up to NATO whether they accept it or not. The final point I'll make on NATO is 3 years ago, I was at a NATO Space Commanders Conference. Today, the other week was the first time I went back. It was unbelievable to me how far NATO have come. And NATO were doing all of the briefing. 3 years ago, it was the nations that were doing all of the briefing. So just how quickly they're developing their theater space component or space theater component, standard operating procedures, all of these sorts of things, I think is super impressive.
We are really running out of time. And I'm going to ask you a really unfair question.
Yeah, go for it.
You've got roughly 12 months left on the clock here. I would love to know, what is the one priority you really want to accomplish before you go? You've got 12 months. I don't want this to sound like you're on, one foot on a banana peel and the other, out the door, because you're not. But 12 months is a very short period of time. You know that. I know that. Should we be expecting more guidance coming from your office on securing space systems across the CISPO nations, communication, integration? What should we expect in the next 12 months out of you?
Well, I'll give you 3 on each of the priority areas, if you like. So the first one, I'd like the execution of the international partner strategy to be self-sustaining. That's it. So when I leave the room, and there may be someone who comes after me, but do we have to call a big meeting to ensure that people are doing the tasks, or is this now become self-sustaining? The engine's up and running. That would be one for me on that one. In terms of CISPO, actually, we're heading towards the end of this year, a goal that we set ourselves. I'd have loved to have achieved that goal. We won't get everything. And I would love to understand what the vision, or to have outputted what the vision for CISPO in 2035 may be. And then on NATO, a number of different things. But at the very basic level, it would be, how does the US Space Force through the component, how does US Spacecom, how do they come together, and how does ultimately command and control work with NATO? So if NATO are executing a plan and they have things called space support requests, what is the mechanism by which the US and other allies receive these space support requests and then execute? So 3 things, very simply.
Big things.
Big things, but hey, look, you got to shoot for the moon, right?
We do. Godders, thank you so much for making the time to come back on the podcast.
Hey, not at all. Love it. Hey, let's do it in a year's time and see what's happening. See whether we made those goals.
I will hit you up on that for sure.
Thanks. Great to see you.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.